Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where I am at the office so early in the morning that there is no light outside, thus I have to use the overhead office lights. They kind of make me glow like an angel, and so I guess that is a positive note, but yeah, if you're watching the video, sorry about that. Maybe one day I'll get better lights. Probably not. The funniest thing happens when I start a project, an online recording project for this channel, whenever I do it. Two things happen. Number one, I instantly get sick, so if I sound a little bit weird, number one, I'm using a slightly different microphone, testing it out, but number two, I'm also very clogged up, sickness, new area, new allergies, etc., so pardon that. Second thing is, I usually record one video and then go and get a haircut, and then come in. So the first video has my hair very, very long, about the longest it's going to ever be, and the second video has my hair very, very short, about the shortest it's ever going to be. So I hope you enjoy that. Other than that, you should probably get turning to Genesis chapter 24. We're going to be dealing with the first 27 verses. I am recording this on Saturday before the actual sermon is preached on Sunday. This is a sermon I've preached before, so I am relatively familiar with it, but still in the process of going through some iterations of thinking through it, trying to figure out what I should be preaching on, some points to make, or how to make the points. I figured I'd go ahead and record this in prospect before it all happens, so that it's just a chance for me to run through it again and to think through it and hopefully give you something worthwhile to think about. And if you're not at church with me on Sunday, and if you are, this is coming out on Monday morning, so maybe it's a good review. The question for today is Genesis 24. We'll be dealing with the first half of the chapter, first 27 verses. This is a very long chapter. 24, it goes more than, 2.5 pages in my Bible here. It's 67 verses long. We're going to be dealing with only 27 of those verses. A lot of the second half of the chapter is a repetition of things that have happened in the first half of the chapter, as well as kind of the conclusion to all those events, and I can very quickly summarize those events. I'm not going to read all 67 verses. That is, it's a funny number, but also it's just a long reading. And so instead we're going to hone in on the first 27 verses because that's where the action happens, or at least that's where what stuff I want to talk about is. What you have in Genesis 24 is modern day Christians can start asking this kind of open-ended, broad question. How do you know how to make good decisions? Right, that's a very open-ended question. How do you know who's the right person to marry? Or how do you know when you should take a job? Or how do you know when you should move somewhere? How do you know when is the right time to make these big decisions? How do you know what's the right answer and how to live properly? And the answer is, I don't know. Because life is weird and stuff is always changing. And in many ways, it would be nice if God would just kind of step in sometimes and tell us one way to go. You should head this way, or here's the right answer, or whatever it is. It would be nice if God came in and did that for us. But a lot of times, he doesn't, or at least not clearly. He does promise help, though. And he does give his wisdom and provide that for us. And it's really nice to see that God has provided his help for other people. How does that work? Well, here are some suggestions. If you want to hear them, here are some suggestions on how is best to actually seek the wisdom and the help of God. In Genesis 24, what's just happened, Sarah has just died. This is back with Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. Isaac was born. Isaac was almost sacrificed in chapter 22. Sarah dies in chapter 23, and now it's finally time for me to be able to breathe. It's finally time for Abraham to find Isaac a wife. Abraham is getting old, and before he dies, he needs to arrange Isaac a marriage so that the holy line can continue and Abraham's lineage doesn't just fizzle out with Isaac. Isaac is kind of not very active. He's not a character who goes out and does much. He's a guy who is kind of an NPC, if you know that terminology. Just, he's there, and that's it. And that's kind of disappointing. Isaac has one chapter in which he does stuff, and then you move on from that. Genesis 24 is Abraham setting up Isaac's marriage. Genesis 25 is Abraham doing some other things. Genesis 26 is about Isaac. Genesis 27 is about Jacob, right? We have a lot about Abraham, a lot about Jacob, a lot about Joseph, pretty much nothing about Isaac. Abraham needs to make sure Isaac is okay. Isaac is really a non-issue. He doesn't do all that much, but Abraham needs to make sure that he's taken care of. And so he needs to find him a wife. Back in these days, in this area, in this time period, arranged marriage was very popular. Even still today, maybe not in every area, but there are still many societies in the kind of center of the world type of area, what we would call the ancient Near East, if we're talking biblical terminology. A lot of modern day countries in those areas still, I believe, practice arranged marriage. At least like India does that. I know some people from there. It's still relatively common as a practice. That's what's going on here. There's a cultural difference in these things, but the main point is Abraham wants Isaac to get married. The covenant of God needs to transfer. It cannot just die off at Isaac. And so Isaac needs a wife, and that's what Genesis 24 is about. Long preamble to finally get us to chapter 24. When I preach this on Sunday, we will not have most of that preamble, but for the fuller context, now you understand the background, and let's read Genesis 24, starting in verse 1. I'm reading New American Standard from the 2020 update. Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of all his household, who was in charge of all that he owned, "Please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac." The servant said to him, "Suppose the woman is not willing to follow me back to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came?" And Abraham said to him, "Beware, you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, 'To your descendants I will give this land,' he will send his angel ahead of you, and you will take a wife from my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free of this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there." So the servant placed his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham, and swore to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master, and went out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand. So he set out and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water when it was evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, "Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today, and show kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the young woman to whom I say, 'Please let down your jar so that I may drink,' and who answers, 'Drink, and I will water your camels also,' may she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. And by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master." And it came about, before he had finished speaking, that behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The young woman was very beautiful, a virgin, no man had had relations with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. And the servant ran to meet her, and said, "Please let me drink a little water from your jar." And she said, "Drink, my lord." Then she quickly lowered her jar to her hand, and gave him a drink. Now, when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I'll also draw water for your camels until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, and ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Meanwhile, the man was taking a close look at her in silence to find out whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel, and 2 bracelets for her wrists weighing 10 shekels in gold, and he said, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room for us to stay overnight at your father's house?" She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, Milcah's son, whom she bore to Nahor." And again she said to him, "We have plenty of both straw and feed, and room to stay overnight." Then the man bowed low and worshipped the Lord. And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and his trustworthiness toward my master. And as for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers." Again, there's more than that. This chapter goes on. You see, the servant meets with Laban, who will come up later, especially in Jacob's story. You see that meeting happen. There's a lot of recitation of what has happened, of the servant's journey, and how the servant has found Rebekah, and how God really wants Rebekah and Isaac to get married. Then there is a whole bit where the servant takes Rebekah back at the end of the chapter, and Isaac ends up marrying her. And so they live happily ever after, or at least for a little while. And it's not particularly happy, but, we don't need to talk about that right now. There's more to this chapter, point being. But the primary focus of this chapter is a promise that is made between Abraham and his servant. Servant, we don't know his name. He is the oldest servant. He's in charge of everything. He's kind of like Joseph to Potiphar later on. He is the servant who is so well trusted, so well known, so well loved, so just well respected that Abraham knows him. Abraham trusts him. Abraham trusts him even with his children's future, or his child's future. It's a very serious responsibility. You see how great this servant is. But what you see in this promise that's made, you have the making of the promise, which primarily involves Abraham calling the servant and demanding something of him, or requesting something of him, commanding something from him. You have a promise being made in verses 1 through 9. That would be point 1 of the sermon. And then you have a promise being kept by the servant. That's point number 2. That's verses 10 through 27. That's the whole rest of the story. If you want the 2-point sermon outline, I know 2-point sermons are heretical, but if you want just the 2-point sermon, there it is. Promise made, promise kept. Abraham, and then the servant whom we don't actually know his name. Water is good. What you have in the first 9 verses, I don't know why I threw that in there. I felt like it was relevant. What you have in the first 9 verses is Abraham calling upon this very trusted servant. Abraham is old. He is very old. He's getting to the point where Isaac needs to be taken care of. Okay, let's find him a wife. I'm too old to travel. I'm too old to go anywhere. Servant of mine, go find him a wife. Take care of him. And so he does. There is a solution for Isaac's wife problem. And it's not to go to the people of the land. We'll talk about this more in a few minutes, but it's not to go to the people around them. Abraham lives in the land of Canaan. There are plenty of human beings, women of Isaac's appropriate age. There are plenty of people that Abraham could marry Isaac off to, but he doesn't want to marry Isaac off to a Canaanite because God has set them apart. Abraham has been promised to one day obtain the land of Canaan, that primarily his descendants will come in and own the land of Canaan. That means God is going to somehow dispossess Canaan of the land. It doesn't seem like a good idea for Abraham to then marry his son into the descendants of the land and gain it that way. God has already promised them the land. They don't need to marry in to try and finagle some, legitimate kingship business in this. No, God has promised them the land. He's going to get rid of Canaan. He's going to restore the people. He's going to put the people of Israel in the land. The ultimate Israelites is what they'll end up being called. There is no reason for the holy bloodline to mingle itself and corrupt itself with the Canaanites. And actually, if the holy bloodline does become Canaanite, then God might just take out the Canaanites too. He might just take out Israel along with the Canaanites because they have corrupted themselves. When God has promised to destroy a people, when God is looking forward to destroying the land of Canaan and the people therein, do not tie yourself into them. It's not a good idea. And so Abraham seeks a wife for Isaac, not from the people around him, not from what is convenient, but from what is actually good and worthwhile. Let's find somebody we trust. Let's find somebody more righteous. Let's go back to Abraham's family. God has not promised to destroy them. God's not going to nuke them from the planet. Abraham's family is the best possible option. And so you see Abraham, and he takes this promise from his servant. He makes a promise with his servant. Hey, here, servant, this is what you are going to do. And you see this in 3 ways. You see Abraham's focus as he goes throughout. His focus is very intentional, and it is very righteous. Abraham focuses primarily on three things. Here are your three subpoints. You have, in the promise is made. The promise is made because Abraham focuses on God. It's made because Abraham focuses on God's promises, and it's made because Abraham focuses on marriage. Those are the three things. The marriage that God instituted. God has put this thing together. Abraham focuses on that. So, those three things, let's put those together and explain each of those. Number one, a promise is being made because Abraham focuses on God. In verse 1, you see that Abraham is old, he's advanced in age, and the Lord has blessed Abraham in every way. You see, God blesses Abraham. Abraham is focused on God. The Lord has blessed Abraham. Abraham is well aware that everything he has is from God's generosity. Even when, in instances where he's done evil, God has provided for him regardless. He's brought him through dangerous situations. He's brought him through all the problem periods. He's given him Isaac, even though that was a physical impossibility. God enabled it to happen. The Lord has blessed Abraham in every way. Everything that Abraham has, he knows it's from God. Abraham is trying to do something good because he knows what God has done for him. God has blessed him, and so he wants to return the favor and do something good for God in return. So, Abraham makes a promise because he's focused on God. He knows that God sees promises, and God is the overseer of promises. Now, to explain this point in full, we get to go to a very uncomfortable area that I will probably not broach on Sunday morning, or at least make a passing reference to it. In verse 2, you have this picture where Abraham, in the midst of calling his servant to take this oath, the way he calls the servant to take the oath is saying, "Place your hand under my thigh." That is a oddly euphemistic phrase for place your hand on the sign of God's covenant, basically. God's covenant with Abraham was assured. It was proposed in chapter 12, and then I think it's 15 really is when it's proposed. But in order to make sure that Abraham is aware of the situation, in Genesis chapter 17, God is trying to build a covenant, and so he decides to make a physical sign, and he gives Abraham a task to go and do to all of the males in Abraham's camp, which is the physical sign of circumcision. Circumcision, if you don't know, is not really something I want to explain to you. It's where the male gets something cut off a very sensitive part of his body. That's where it goes. That's the sign of the covenant. When Abraham says, "Place your hand under my thigh," that is a euphemistic phrase for place your hand on the sign of the covenant, which is to say, grab the area that has been circumcised and promise on that. Just like in the modern day, well, in, I guess, 200 years ago, modern day, Victorian era, people would swear on their mother's grave or swear on, something important. I swear on the holy book that something will happen. When you make promises by promising on something greater than yourself, even the Bible addresses this, God makes a promise based on himself. He swore by himself because he couldn't swear by anything greater. I think that's in Hebrews. I could be horribly wrong about that, but I think that's in Hebrews. Just like we would promise something on something greater than ourselves, or people have done that through the ages, so too is Abraham doing that. He's making a promise based on the covenant of God, and the way he does it is by making a promise based on the sign of the covenant. I swear by this action, this body part that God has commanded to be cut. I swear that I will fulfill that, is the gist of what's going on there. Point being, Abraham sees that God is the overseer of promises. The Lord is the one who pays attention to the promises, and so he swears by things that the Lord values. The other way you can see this, and the simple way to make that point, is to see in verse 3, "I'll make you swear by the Lord." He just kind of says that. Less impactful. It's there's more to it than just, you can swear by the name of God. No, you're swearing by the sign of God and the covenant of God, and there's a physical aspect to that. But you can also see the same point. In general, the Lord is the one who ensures that promises are kept. I will swear by the Lord because he will keep account of that promise. I will swear by the Lord so that so that I am faithful and I remember to actually do what God wants me to do. Abraham focuses on God. You can see it in his recognition of how God has blessed him. Verse 1, you can see it in his recognition that God is in charge of promises. Verses 2 and 3, and in respect to that, you can see that Abraham is focused on God because Abraham knows that the Lord has a definite plan that he wants to accomplish. In verse 7, especially, when the servant says in verse 5, what if I find a woman and she's pretty cool, but she won't come back to the land of Canaan? Should I take Isaac away from the land of Canaan? Abraham says, absolutely not, in verse 6. Beware you don't take my son back there. But in verse 7, why? Why is Abraham so afraid of his son going back to a foreign land, or to the ancestral land he used to have? It's because God has a plan. And Abraham wants God's plan to be accomplished without issue. The Lord, the God of heaven, verse 7, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, who spoke to me, he swore to me, saying, to your descendants I will give this land. He'll send an angel before you, and you'll take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman's not willing, then fine, you don't have to keep the oath, right? If you can't find a woman to come back to this land, then clearly God doesn't want her. And so we'll leave her alone, because God has promised. God has a plan that Abraham's descendants stay in the land of Canaan. That's what God wants to happen. Abraham knows that. And Abraham is focused on God, so Abraham wants to keep him there. Abraham has a job to do. It's to stay in the land of Canaan, and he is not going to shirk his responsibility towards God. He knows what God wants of him. He's very aware of what God has done for him, what God continues to do for him, and what God is expecting of him. And so, Abraham focuses on God. That's the first thing. Abraham is a great man of faith because of stuff like this. That's the first thing you see. Second thing you see is Abraham focuses on God's promises specifically, which is kind of similar. There's some amount of overlap to the previous point, but it's distinct enough that I have to make this its own point. Number one, Abraham is focused on the promise of God, so that Abraham knows that Isaac, for instance, needs a wife. In verse 4, you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. Why does he care about Isaac having a wife? Well, God had promised that through Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through his descendants. Okay, Isaac is his descendant, but Isaac doesn't have any descendants. Who comes after Isaac? Right? Where's the rest of the line of Abraham? Isaac needs a wife so that he propagates the line of Abraham, so that all the nations of the world can be blessed. God's promise is for Abraham's offspring, that he will have descendants and they will be worthwhile. That means Isaac needs descendants. And so Abraham seeks out a wife in part to fulfill the promise of God and to help that happen. Abraham knows that the promise of God means Isaac's going to get a wife sometime, and it's either now, while Abraham can help him make a good choice, or later when Abraham is dead and Isaac just has to do things by himself to give his son the best possible chance of fulfilling the promise in as optimal a way as possible. Abraham gets involved here. Abraham helps to pick a wife. Isaac needs a wife, and so Abraham helps him out. The second thing you see is Abraham knows the promises of God. Abraham's focused on that. It's not just that Isaac's going to need a wife. It is that Abraham knows where they are going to live. Point being, from verses 6 and 7, funny number, God has promised the land. If I don't want that to stick around as a joke, I shouldn't make the joke. It's not even very funny. God has promised Abraham a land for his descendants. Abraham knows that they need to stay in the land, and so he commands them to stay in the land. I already mentioned all of this, right? The servant is called to go and call Isaac from that, or call a woman from that land to go and come back to the land of Canaan to be with Isaac. Isaac cannot go to the other land. God has promised them this land. They should stay in it. You've seen problems arise before when they haven't actually stayed in the land. You go back to chapter 12. God had called Abraham to come down to the land of Canaan. This is the land that I'm going to give you. Immediately, there's this famine, so Abraham leaves in chapter 12 and verse 10. He goes down to Egypt, I believe it is, and lies about his wife and almost gets himself killed and such like that. Not a good situation. You see the same kind of instance happen in chapter 20 in verse 1. There is also he leaves. Oh, right. It's because Sodom and Gomorrah happen, and Abraham sees that, and he sees how serious it is. And so he leaves the area. He goes and settles somewhere else. He lies about his wife again, almost gets himself killed again, etc., etc. Bad things happen. Whenever Abraham leaves the land that God told him to stay in, something bad happens. And so he knows Isaac should not leave the land he's been told to stay in. Isaac needs to stay in Canaan. God has made promises that Isaac will have descendants. Abraham will help that happen. God has made promises that Isaac will stay in the land of Canaan. Abraham is going to help that happen. God has made promises that that these things are going to happen to Abraham's descendants. But even so, and as much as Abraham is trying to help make these promises happen, it's important to note verse 8. That Abraham, as focused as he is on the promises of God, Abraham knows that God may well view this differently. In verse 8, you're going to go and take a wife from my family, in verse 7. But, in verse 8, if she doesn't come back, then you're free of the oath. Abraham has his ideas on how these things are going to play out. But Abraham knows that God may well view this differently, and he's not going to insist upon his own way. God didn't say, Abraham, Isaac needs to marry your nieces. He didn't say, Abraham, Isaac needs to marry a family member. God didn't say, Abraham, Isaac can't marry a Canaanite. He's never said that. All God has said is that Isaac will have descendants. Abraham is trying to find faithful spouse for there to be faithful descendants. Abraham's trying to do the best he can to avoid the Canaanite thing, but God has not specified. Maybe Canaan's fine. Maybe that is the way that Isaac will come into possession of the land of Canaan. Abraham does not know the will of God directly. He knows the generic will of God, but he doesn't know all the specific details. And so he knows God may view this situation differently. God may act differently in the situation. Abraham does his best within that. He will act as he can. He will act on what he knows, and he will see what happens because of it. But he doesn't ultimately know God's purpose. And so, just kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3, we know that God could save us. We don't know if he's going to. Well, we know God's power and ability. We don't know how that's going to manifest. But we're going to do our best anyway. Go and find him a wife. If there is no wife that you can find, maybe God doesn't want him to find a wife like that. If there is no wife he can find, well, maybe God's saving that for a future occasion. But as much as is within you, you try it. And so, let's go out and try. Let's go and attempt to find him a wife. There is no attempt to force his will on God. A lot of people would try and twist God's arm or force God to obey them. No. God's will be done. If God doesn't want it done this way, it's not going to happen this way. And if it doesn't happen this way, that's fine, and we'll work something else out. We'll wait and see what God has in mind. Abraham is no stranger to attempting things like chapter 16, to attempting the Hagar and Ishmael thing. That Ishmael would live before you. No, I'm not interested in Ishmael. I'm interested in Isaac. I'll help Ishmael survive. I'll help Isaac. That's the one I'm interested in. Abraham has tried to force God's hand before, and it hasn't happened. And so now in his old age, Abraham is well aware of the promises of God and decides to actually work with them and work around them to incorporate them and focus on those. Instead of trying to enforce his will on God, he's letting God do things himself. There is no attempt to force God to obey. It's just, we'll try this, and if not, well, God's will be done. It's important to note that I'm going to skip that, actually. I'm going to take this out. This doesn't have any relevance. I'm sure it was very relevant when I first wrote the sermon, but it doesn't really fit in there. God's will be done is the point. Abraham is focused on God. Abraham is focused on God's promises. Third thing that Abraham is focused on, and you see the importance of, is you see the importance of marriage. Marriage is fascinating in this section. This is mainly a sermon on prayer, by the way. We haven't even gotten to the prayer yet, but it's mainly a sermon on prayer. We're only halfway through. This is primarily a sermon on prayer, but it does also double as a sermon on marriage. Marriage is really important, and Abraham expresses that very well in verses 3 and 4. I'll make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. Why? Why dodge the Canaanites? Well, it's because marriage ties you to people. Do you want to be tied to the Canaanites? Or do you want to be tied to the family? Right? What people are you going to tie yourself to? This is why marriage is so important. This is one reason why. It's not just that it's a permanent institution. It's not just that, you have a chance to get it right, and after that, you don't get to back out of it. You don't get to run away. You have one chance to get it right, and if you don't get it right, you cause yourself pain for the rest of your life. What person do you want to tie yourself to? And by extension, what kind of people, not just the individual, but what kind of people do you want to tie yourself to? Personally, this is a question. Is your spouse going to help you be faithful to God? If not, then personally, you probably shouldn't tie yourself to a person who's not interested in helping you be faithful to the Lord. Familially, the whole extended family. When you marry a spouse, it's not just the one person. A lot of times it's expressed as you're marrying the family. You're marrying into the family. Will the extended family be a blessing to you, or will they be a burden to you? There are some families that are good. There are some families that are not. Is your extended family going to help you? If not, even if it's a great person individually, maybe that's not worth the struggle that it might bring with it. There's a question on that. Personally, familially, there are challenges. Culturally, will your marriage help you? Is Christianity accepted or rejected by your spouse, by your extended family, in the places that you're going to have to go? If you have to go and visit your extended family and it's in an area where there aren't really any Christians, even if they don't hate Christianity, if there aren't any churches to go and be around there, it's going to be very difficult to go and visit them and be a good influence on them. Personally, familially, culturally, how easy is it going to be for you to actually tie yourself to these people? It's not to say you have to view life in exactly the same way. It's not to say that everything has to be exactly the same, shared between the spouses or the families. You're not going to find someone you 100% agree with in everything. But you can definitely make it easier on yourself by choosing very wisely. Marriage ties you to people. Abraham knows this. He doesn't want Isaac tied in with the Canaanites. He wants Isaac tied in with the rest of the family whom God has decided to bless. And so the suggestion here, the kind of underlying suggestion, is don't be one of those people who just picks from the people of the land, right? You have Canaanites around you. Don't be a guy who just goes out and picks a Canaanite. Everybody lives in a situation where they live around people of the world, people of the land. Paul would express this in the New Testament in, I think it's 2 Corinthians, calling it unequally yoked. Somebody who believes in the Lord marrying someone who doesn't believe in the Lord, or someone who actively doesn't, or who actively rejects the Lord, or is very actively vocal and hostile towards the Lord. Don't be unequally yoked with someone who is not on the Lord's side. That's a bad idea. That's not going to age well. Of course that's not going to go well. Why would you pick to tie yourself to someone you know is lost, or someone you know is, at best, unreliable. And this is not to say that, if the person goes to a church, then they're good. No, there are plenty of people who go to church who are not very good marriage material candidates. This is not right. It's not that if you show up in a church building on Sunday, then you're instantly a go and everything's great. No, but it is a picture. When you're thinking to get married, if you're thinking to get married, you need to be very careful who you're looking at. The person themselves could be a detriment to you. The family of the person could be a detriment to you. The culture of the person's family could be a detriment to you. And you don't want to tie yourself to people who are not faithful and not going to help you be faithful. It's only going to lead to pain, right? There are some exceptions where by marriage, somebody convinces the spouse to ultimately convert, and then the whole family ultimately converts. There are success stories like that. It is far from given. And so be very careful who you pick to tie yourself to. You're never going to get rid of all the issues, but you sure can minimize potential issues. That's one of the warnings you should take from Abraham's stance on Genesis 24. So, Abraham is focused on God. God is good to him, and so he tries to be good to God. Abraham's focused on God's promises. He knows some things that God has commanded. He wants to do his best to keep within those promises, and if he's reading the promises wrong or interpreting things wrong, then, God's will be done. But as much as is possible, he's trying to follow after what he knows, what he assumes to be right and to be the correct interpretation. And Abraham also cares about marriage. He focuses on that because he knows that's going to set Isaac up for success or failure. And ultimately, one might even argue that marrying into Rebekah's family with Laban and how you see Isaac and Rebekah act later towards Jacob and Esau, you can argue that that's not exactly a great situation that ended up coming out of this, but that's kind of irrelevant for later, and that's more due to their personal choices than it is the focus of the sermon. Abraham is trying to make good choices, and so he makes the best choices he can. No situation's going to be perfect, but you can try. And so Abraham is trying, and he sends out his servant. So, only 37 minutes in. We've only passed the normally allotted amount of time for a sermon by 7 minutes. And now we're on to the second half, which is actually a lot larger than the first half, because the first half is only 9 verses, and the second half is everything from verses 10 to 27. So, good luck. Tomorrow, I'm going to need to speed this up and cut out a lot of that other detail, but the reason I have a YouTube channel is so that I can give extended versions of this, so that I can fully flesh out ideas, so that even if people miss it on Sunday, they can come back here and watch it and get a fuller-fledged understanding of where I'm coming from, in addition to everything else. So, the promise is made in verses 1 through 9. Now, we're to the part where the promise is kept. Oh, I'm only a page and a half into 4 pages. That's not good. Well, now we get to the part where the promise is kept. The servant travels with 10 camels. Camels are rarities at that time, especially as, in that area of the world, especially as pets. Camels were not very common back then, or at least not very common to own, and so 10 camels is like this kind of weird flex where Abraham is proclaiming his riches. It also says that the servant took a variety of good things. He took a bunch of Abraham's money, as we'll see later on. Servant, when he finds Rebekah, he gives her, money and jewelry and stuff to care for her. By the way, when her brother Laban, later in the chapter, he is convinced to let Rebekah marry Isaac because he sees all the money that came from Abraham. That is an interesting point that plays into the point I'm going to make in a second. Firstly, you see Laban kind of characterized as a greedy man. It should not surprise us then later on when he's a bit greedy when he deals with Jacob in later chapters of Genesis. That's who he is. That's what he chose, and that's how he wanted to live his life. So don't be surprised by that. But returning back, as they used to say, Abraham is sending his camels, proclaiming his wealth. He's sending a lot of money, proclaiming his wealth. Abraham is taking his God-given wealth, and he's using that to seek a good marriage for his son. In other words, Abraham is using the physical God-given wealth that he received to go and seek spiritual success for his family. That is really important. That isn't even a main point. That's like a sub point because the guy had some camels, right? But that's so important. If you have physical wealth and if you have money, you need to be using that. Like, what are you doing with that? It needs to be invested in spiritual blessing for your family. That's what physical wealth is for. Too many people take physical money and use it to try and, buy a bigger house for themselves, buy a nicer car for themselves, or do whatever it is, provide a better toy for your children, or more toys for your children, or whatever it is, take them to this event, or whatever it is. That's not what money's for, right? Money is not for your physical prosperity. Money is so that you can build yourself up spiritually. That's what the blessing is. If you have money and you're not investing it in spiritual things, you need to fix some stuff, right? You need to iron out your priorities. Abraham uses all of his money to get Isaac into a good marriage so that Isaac will be spiritually encouraged to be faithful. Does it work? I don't really know. Again, jury's out on that. You have to read later chapters and you have to factor in Isaac and Rebekah's individual choices. But the point is, Abraham is sacrificing his physical wealth so that he can do his best to ensure spiritual success for his children. That's really important. People don't understand that. People don't do that nowadays in a lot of cases. We need to be doing that. We need to be paying attention and going after the spiritual success. He comes to the city of Nahor. The servant makes it to the city of Nahor. Nahor is Abraham's brother, and so it figures that perhaps family would be nearby. If he's looking for a family member, he'll probably run across somebody in this area, and so he sits by the well and he waits for potential candidates. Now, this is fascinating because Abraham's servant is unnamed. We don't know who he is, but Abraham's servant goes and prays to God, and this is 24 chapters into Genesis, the first time we have seen anyone pray to God for help. The first recorded instance of someone asking God to help them is Genesis 24 and an unnamed servant who's trying to arrange a marriage for somebody. That's significant, right? I don't know all of the degrees of significance, and I'm not going to try and go into that. But here's the point: this is the first time we see a prayer, basically, a prayer to God, saying, "I don't know what to do. I need help in this situation." It happens all the way back here. This is what, 4,000 years ago? A little under. Abraham lived around 1875 BC or something like that. This is around 4,000 years ago. And here you have a picture of a man who needs help, and so he prays to God for it. And what you see, as much as you saw Abraham's faith when he focused on God and God's promises and on marriage, those important things, you see the servant's faith when you see what he focuses on. He focuses on 4 things. In the Star Wars fandom, we call this the Imperial Walker Prayer. That's a terrible joke. You're welcome. The point being, he focuses on 4 things, and they lay out like this: ask, think, act, thank. AT-AT, you're welcome. It's a Star Wars reference. Ask, think, act, thank. When you're trying to pray, when you're trying to ask for help, these 4 points are really important for you to actually keep in mind. There needs to be asking, there needs to be thinking, there needs to be acting, there needs to be thanking. If you don't have these 4 elements, you're missing part of a well-rounded prayer, and it is incredible that a man who has, the first man in recorded history to actually ask God for something, nailed all of those elements. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So what do they mean? Ask, think, act, think. Start with the first one, which is ask. Asking takes place primarily in verses 12 through 14. He says, "Lord, please grant me success today. Show kindness to my master. I am standing here. These women are coming out. I don't really know what I'm looking for. I don't know who to talk to. I don't know who I'm looking for. So may it be that the one that please show me the sign," right? The one that I ask to give me a drink, if she volunteers to help my camels get a drink as well, let her be the right one. That is the servant's request. God wants us to ask. If you're praying, God wants you to ask. Relationships go both ways. Why would God answer you if you don't ask? If you're not interested in asking him for something, there's no reason for him to answer you and give you the something. And so the servant knows enough to seek the help of God by doing the simple thing of asking and verbalizing what he wishes. Now you notice how he asks. He does not ask selfishly. He asks God to be faithful to his master Abraham in verse 12. Grant me success, show kindness to my master. Here's how, here's what I'm looking for. Here's how that could be done. He's not asking God to be helpful to him personally. He's not asking God to make him rich. He's not asking God to make him important. He's not asking God to take away any effort that he has to put in. He's not asking God for what he personally wants. He's asking God to be able to serve others. There is no selfishness in how he asks. He asks to serve. He is not forceful in how he asks. There is a simple request that doesn't have to be fulfilled. May it be that the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar that I may drink, who approves of watering the camels, who volunteers to water the camels, may it be that she's the right one. And if she isn't the right one, okay, right? If she isn't the right one, then that's how it goes. If she isn't the right one, we'll have to look for some other way of getting to know people. I don't know, right? This is a way in which I could get started, so if it happens that way, then that would be great. There is no forceful command of God to obey him. He is asking God for some wisdom and for some luck, but he's just asking God, hey, maybe you make it this way, and if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But there is no forcefulness in his request. He is asking, but he's not selfish. He is not forceful. And by the way, he's not asking for something that's impossible. He's not asking for a miracle like Gideon would do later on. He's not asking for God to do something that could never happen normally or under normal physical circumstances. He is asking for something unusual. He's got 10 camels. Camels drink a lot of water. That's kind of the whole bit of a camel. It would be very unusual for someone to volunteer to water all of your camels. That's probably quite a bit of work. But it's not impossible. I mean, if there was a really nice person, hey, you're clearly in need. Okay, I can spare, half an hour or an hour, whatever it takes to actually make sure that you're taken care of. If you're dealing with a really kind person, then it is possible. Somebody might volunteer, and that could be a sign. It's not a miraculous sign, but it is a sign. And so he asks God. He just asks for help. He's not selfish. He's not forceful. It's not impossible. He just asks for help. And God may or may not answer him directly. God may or may not say yes. God may or may not fully approve of this. You never know what he's going to answer. You don't really know how he's going to answer, but you never know what might happen. And so he asks. That's part one. After asking, then comes the important bit. Verses 15 through 21, well, asking is important, but there are also three other important bits. There are 4 points to this in all. After he asks, that's point one, he takes time to think. Thinking is heavily underrated, but it's really important. Verses 15 through 21, Rebecca comes out. Rebecca is the book spoils it for us. She is a relative. She is Abraham's, niece? The wife of, she was born to the wife of Abraham's brother, so yeah, she's born to Abraham's sister-in-law, so she would be his niece. I think that's how it worked. Family relations always confuse me. Whatever. Point is, she's family, right? The servant doesn't know this. The servant doesn't know who she is, but we do, and so we get to play this, we get to see this play out from the other side. How do we know that God is answering us when we pray, right? How does the servant know that God is answering, and it came about before he had finished speaking that the right person just happened to show up? We can see that God is acting behind the scenes. The servant can't see that. And oftentimes when we pray, God may be enacting an answer, and we can't see it from where we're at, from our perspective at that very moment. how do we know that when God is answering us? The answer is you have to start putting in a little bit of effort. It's not good enough to just ask. If all you do is ask, but then you never consider how God might answer or what God's answer might be, when you take a look at all the things happening around you and you never think, oh, that could be what God's doing here, then you've missed out on something. If you ask but never think, you've missed it, because God requires us to put in a little bit of effort. Servant sees a girl. What happens if he just stands back and never asks for water, right? It's not his request was, if somebody offers him water, if somebody offers him water when he asks them, then maybe that'll be the right person. What if he doesn't ask her? What if he doesn't go and try to engage in it? What if he doesn't think and step forward and asks her for something normal? He just asks her, by the way, for a little water, and she volunteers to serve, and she volunteers to serve all of his camels as well. Half an hour or multiple hours beyond what he just requested. This is an exact fulfillment of the sign that he had asked for. But the servant doesn't know what to do about it, because the odds of him praying to God and asking for help and then immediately receiving help, the odds of that happening are frankly astronomical for that to be able to work so smoothly. Are you sure about that? And so you see a really important verse in verse 21. He goes out, he asks her, she volunteers. He says, wow, interesting. And then verse 21, as she's running back and forth, watering his camels, as she's taking care of all of the animals he has, the man was taking a close look at her in silence to find out whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. That verse is why the sermon came about, because I was reading that one day and said, that is an interesting line to put in there, isn't it? The man is sitting back, wondering, is this the answer that God has provided? Could it be God's grace revealed to him? Could it be that she's the answer? Or, well, maybe it's not. God doesn't directly weigh in on the issue. At least not that we're told, not that we're shown, not that's recorded. God doesn't say, this is my beloved, Abraham's niece in whom I have decided Isaac is going to marry. He doesn't say anything like that. God does not directly weigh in on the issue. God never steps in and says, hey, this is the right person. There is no finger of God coming from the sky and saying, you should pay attention to her. It happens that she fulfilled the sign that he had asked for. Could that be a fulfillment of the whole request that he had asked for? Could it be that this is Abraham's relative? The man still doesn't know. All the man knows is she volunteered to water his camels. He doesn't know anything beyond that. God doesn't directly say, Rebecca is the right choice. God does, instead, expect us to take our best guess at what the answer is. It could be that this woman is Abraham's family. It could be that she isn't. It could be that this is God's way of saying the sign is something pretty stupid, right? It could be that the man has asked for a sign for one of Abraham's relatives, essentially to volunteer to water all of his camels. It could be that God has this random woman come up and water all of his camels, and it turns out she's not Abraham's relative at all, and then the man doesn't need any of his camels watered, and the ability for him to receive that sign is taken away. It could be that this is God mocking the sign. It could be that this is God removing the sign. It could be that God is removing the temptation of the man to ask for a sign. The man doesn't know any of these things. You see something happen, he doesn't know what to think. Too many people rush in. They say, God, if you want me to ask this girl on a date, then make sure she says something nice to me. And then you go and say something to her, and she says something nice to you, so you're like, oh, wow, well, God has set us up now. That's stupid, isn't it? That's not taking any time to actually think. Has God answered this? How has God answered this? Could this be an answer that God has provided? If the camels are all full and she's not family, think about how screwed up that is. The man's sign is just out the window. It's gone. But maybe she is. Asking God is good. We need to ask God. But thinking about the answer, or thinking about the evidence that God has now provided, thinking about what has happened since, is also required. It's not enough to ask for an answer. You have to consider what the answer is. If you're not looking for God's answers, how are you going to know that he has answered? You ask God. If you want to pray to God, you want God's help, you ask him for his help. And then you think about whether or not he has provided his help and everything that comes after that. Third, ask, think, act is number 3, verses 22 through 25. It's not very intelligent for you to put in all this effort to think about what the answer is and then not do anything about it. And so, as the camels have finished drinking, before the woman can get away and get back to the house where she's supposed to be, the man steps forward and offers her something. How do we know when God is answering us? You have to put in a little bit of effort. He steps forward to pursue this option, even though, importantly, he does not know whether or not this is the right woman. He doesn't know if she's related. He doesn't know if she's one of Abraham's family or she's totally unrelated and he's just going to leave her alone. He takes some stuff, a ring and 2 bracelets, and he says, "Who are you?" Like, hoping for the good answer, hoping that this is Abraham's relative, but he doesn't actually know. We know, from our audience perspective, we get the Genesis overview, we understand who this is, but the man doesn't. He steps forward in faith to ask, "Are you Abraham's relative? And if so, would you like to marry Isaac?" Right? Sometimes people ask God. Sometimes people think about the answer and they decide that God has given them an answer. They decide based on all the evidence, I think God probably has answered me. But they never actually act on it. They never actually go and confirm that. They never actually do anything with that. They think about it, but then they don't actually engage. And coming to the right conclusion without any action is worthless. The man's wish is confirmed when he steps forward. He asks, he works with her, right? He acts upon the sign that may or may not have been given. He acts in faith, and then he gets the conclusion to God, from God. It turns out that, yes, this is Abraham's relative. It turns out that the sign did work. It turns out that God did do what the servant asked him to do. God is nice like that. God didn't have to, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The man could pray for this and God say, no, I don't think I'm going to. Perfectly within his rights to do as God of the universe. But you do see in this instance, God is nice to the man. This is Abraham's relative. And so everything's going to work out. And that's when the 4th step of this paradigm comes into play. Because as soon as he asks who she is, she answers him in verse 24, I am Abraham's family, essentially. Verse 25, you can come and stay with us. You see the generosity. The man, instead of saying, oh, thank you, and going to the house, instead, immediately, verse 26, bows low and worships God. Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and his trustworthiness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers. When you pray, how do you react when God answers? Sometimes God says yes, and sometimes God says no. Sometimes he says maybe or maybe later, whatever it might be. What do you say when God answers one of your prayers? Do you stop and turn to God and give him thanks and the praise he deserves? Because a lot of people forget this last step. And there are a lot of people who are willing to ask, right? Some people are willing to ask, and they ask and they eventually get their answer. Great. Some people are even willing to think about the answer and figure out whether it's an answer from God or not, and that's even better. Some people are even willing to then act upon the answer that they've come across, to act in faith and to try and confirm that answer to see whether or not it was positive or not. That's even better. Asking, thinking, acting, those are all progressive steps. But a lot of people, even the ones that remember to ask and think and act, even the ones who up until this point have acted faithfully, a lot of people forget to turn around and thank God. The servant knows it's not him who did this. It's not his skill at finding people that found this woman. He knows that God provided it for him. And so, the first person to pray a recorded prayer asking for help actually remembers the fourth step, which is turning around and thanking God for the blessing that he gave them. It's very easy to ask God to help you. It's very difficult to remember to turn around and thank him. But the servant remembers who provided. The servant remembers who did all the work. The servant remembers that it's not him. And it's all about the Lord. He is the one who's working here. The emphasis is on the Lord. Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham. The emphasis is on the Lord. He's the one who's working. He's the one who's been faithful. He's the one who listened to the promise, and he accounted for the promise, and he actually fulfilled the promise. He didn't have to, but he chose to. Blessed be the Lord. He is the one who's working. He is the good one. And so there's a blessing pronounced there. That's the first emphasis, is on the Lord. Second emphasis is on Abraham. Blessed be the Lord, verse 27, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and his trustworthiness toward my master. The Lord has showed faithfulness to Abraham. Abraham has asked, Abraham has sought, Abraham has tried to act in faith, and so God has provided for him. The emphasis is on the Lord. The emphasis is secondly on Abraham, and then, as the least of these, thirdly, the emphasis is ultimately on the servant. And as for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers. The third point is for the servant last, right? What's the most important thing? It's that God is good. What's the second most important thing? It's that God has been good to my master. He's been good to others. He's allowed he's allowed others to be provided for. What's the most important thing? Well, the third thing, I guess, is that God's been nice to me and he made my job easy. There's humility in that. The servant doesn't think more highly of himself than he ought to. He thinks of God, he thinks of Abraham, and then, oh yeah, and God helped me too. When you pray, do you remember the selflessness and praising? And do you remember to praise the goodness of the Lord? When you pray, do you remember to thank God for his answers, the answers that he provides to you? Here it was a yes. Do you remember to thank God if you ask him for safety? I was praying for something the other day. I asked God to make sure I got through a situation okay, and I got through the situation okay. I forgot to say thank you. Probably not great. When you pray, do you remember to thank God when the answer is yes? Do you remember to thank God when the answer is no? When the answer is not what you want? Do you remember to thank God when your job is easy? And do you remember to thank God when your job is not easy, actually? Do you remember to thank God when he answers you? Whatever the answer, do you remember to thank God? Because he knows what he's doing. And so that's the lesson. Be thankful. God steps in to help his people, the people being those who acknowledge him and act like it. Sometimes it's a clear answer, sometimes it's not, but either way, he calls his people to get involved. It's not going to go well if you ask God for something, but you never actually get yourself out there and go and do the work that you're supposed to. It doesn't do any good for you to meet the right person, but then never pursue it. It doesn't do any good for you to ask God to answer you and then not act upon the answer. God is always there, but he wants his people to get involved too. And so that's where we will end up leaving it today. Abraham looked at the promises of God, a great nation and a great land, and a future descendant who blesses the whole world, and he worked toward that as best as he knew how. To achieve those things, Isaac is going to need a wife, and so let's go and find one. How do you ask God for help? You aim for the goal, and you ask God for help, and then you do the best that you can. So are you seeking the things of God, is the question. Are you actually doing that? Or are you just kind of floating through life and doing it by yourself? If so, you need to reevaluate. And you need to get back on God's team. Thanks for listening to Biblical Breadcrumbs. Hopefully that is helpful to you. And I will see you in the next video. Releases on probably Friday, if I remember to do it right. We're going to be talking about the second part, the second lesson in the Sermon on the Mount series, which is ultimately the next step in the first part of the Sermon on the Mount. I'll see you then.